And we're live. We're live with Erin Vassilopoulos. Have I completely butchered that, or
No,
did I?
no, that's right. That's it.
That's right. Okay, Eastern European pronunciation working out.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
she is the director of Superior, and also the co-editor of Superior, and also the co-writer of Superior.
Hmm.
And there's so much to talk about with this film. It just started playing last night at Pandance, virtually. I know you hate that word. I feel like you might hate that word. Do you hate that word a little bit just because of how
I
this film
don't
was made
know.
and mixed
Oh,
feelings?
mixed feelings, but definitely used to it at this point. So I feel like I've embraced the virtual screenings by now.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, our helpful Q&A allows people, our helpful FAQ on the website allows people to hook Roku TV and Apple TV up to their TV screens. So if you did end up screening Superior on your phone, don't tell us about it because I'm not going to be happy
Yeah.
with you. I don't think anyone's going to be happy with you, but hopefully with the access to cheaper home theaters, people are sort of semi getting the experience that you would have wanted when you made this film. Later today, we're going to be talking to Carlota Pareda, who made Gerdita, which was a short that was adapted to a feature. But what some people may not know is Superior is also a short that was adapted to a feature, also supported by Sundance. So let's talk about this 5 year process because it is a 6 year process. It's longer,
Yeah,
right?
longer. Let's see. Yeah, about 6 years.
Because 2015, the short comes
The
out.
short came out in 2015, but I actually started it way back in 2012.
Okay.
2013. Yeah. I think and that's when I was in film school at NYU, and I wrote this short film about identical twin sisters, sort of based on fraternal twin sister friends that I had had growing up and their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But then, yeah, I kind of wrote this short that I was excited about, but I had no idea how I was going to cast it. And then was very lucky to meet Ani and Alessandra Mesa, who are the leads in the short and the feature. Yeah, I ended up casting them in the short, I think in 2013. And then, yeah, the short premiered at Sundance 2015, and we kept in touch. We became pretty close on the short, and sort of kept in touch, supporting each other's work in the years to follow. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was not until 2018 that Alessandra actually approached me and asked if I want to consider co-writing, not even Feet Superior, just something together. She's been writing more since we made the short. Um, so we got together and pretty quickly just like lapsed back, not lapsed back, but got back into the world of the short and got excited about
Mm-hmm.
the idea, just thinking about where are these characters now.
Yeah.
So it's rather than sort of like turning the short into a feature, we also, because by then they were much older, they were no longer, they played teenagers in the short. So
Right.
that wasn't even really a possibility to like stretch the short into a feature, but we decided to sort of treat the short film as a prologue, to a feature film that picks up the story 6 years later.
Yeah, it's interesting. Having now, when we programmed the feature, we obviously checked out the short just out of curiosity, and it's so interesting to imagine the gap between that and how y'all must have grown. You've used the same DP on
Yes.
both the short and the feature, the same lead actresses, both of them. Um, Talk about there was a notion yesterday about when you find people that you want to work with, try to keep working with them as much as you can. So talk about
Definitely.
that sort of working relationship and can perhaps compare and contrast the first time versus the second time, and
Hmm.
perhaps how things maybe that weren't so smooth the first time ended up smoother the second time, or how that helped.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I think that's a great. I often tell people that, like, if I have any advice, just my experience in this whole process is like work with people that, work with your friends,
Mm-hmm.
just like collaborate, because I feel like we were at a point before the feature that we were all not like stuck, but we had all been like
Yeah.
trying to get things going and like sort of not, like just at this sort of like pass in our careers. And I don't know, I do think a lot came out of this collaboration. And what was the question? Oh, how was it different from the
Yeah,
short to
like
the feature?
how did having
Yeah,
worked together before
it
on
was
yeah.
it was yeah, no, the by the time we made the feature, we knew each other so well. And like you said, working with the same DP, Mia Chofi Henry, who was also my classmate at NYU, which
Oh,
is
that's
how we
cool.
started working together. Yeah, so there was so much familiarity that I think it did make the process of making a first feature much more like really comfortable. And
Right.
we sort of had a lot of like shorthand, especially with Mia on how we would shoot and light and just sort of like the visual style of the film.
Hmm.
It also really helped to have a short to refer back to, as
Yeah.
like we're trying to continue this world. So like with our costume designer and production designer, we were able to sort of like
Right.
point to that as a reference, which was really helpful. Um, but yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I don't know. I would like to say that the feature was like way smoother process because we knew each other, but I think there were certain things that certainly helped, and also the fact that I had co-written the feature with Alessandra,
Hmm.
and often Ani was like there during some of our writing sessions, or was at least just like reading drafts. So we were
Right.
really immersed in the script and the story by the time we started shooting.
Hmm.
But I would say, making a feature is so much harder than making a short. So even though we had all of that coming into the feature, it was still like, I would say, very, very challenging for all of us, and just like a new experience that none of us had
Hmm.
tackled. So,
There's so many genre elements in this film, so many genres crossed and blended throughout the film. I often, criticize this notion of genre as a very limiting theory in which, every film is a genre cross if you really think about it. There's nothing like that's purely a drama. There's always a comedic element, a horror element to it. So how do you blend? But those genre elements are often very hidden, and in this they're not. There's a very clear horror undercurrent for me, at least watching it. There's a thriller undercurrent. There's definitely a musical component to this. There's
hmm
funny moments. I think that's just life, right?
hmm,
So, I
yeah,
almost feel like sort of embarrassed asking the question of like, well, how do you
right.
blend so many genres? It's like, well, how do you live? It's your life, So, I think what's my question here is like, well,
I know what you're
like,
saying. Like, where did all these genres come from? Kind
how
of
do you
question.
blend them without losing anyone? Like it's like
Yeah,
because there's a competition almost between what you want to do and what people will be okay with you doing as an audience, right?
yeah,
Flipping between certain things and then finding some harmonizing element to root all those things together in a way that doesn't feel jarring. So how do you blend
yeah.
genres in a way that doesn't feel distracting, cohesive?
That's a
Yeah,
good question.
thank
Yeah,
God.
that's a good question. And it was no, we got there. Yeah, it was definitely challenging, and it's like a lot of that was in the script, and a lot of that started in the short, like the different genres. But
Mm,
then a lot of just the balancing act that you're describing came in the edit, because we
okay.
sort of when we started cutting, it was like, oh dear, like we have a lot of different tones, and it was exciting, and I always sort of wanted the movie to have that, but it was also like you're saying, you're trying to keep, you want to keep the audience
Right.
in the film, and also we needed sort of a through line to all of that. So like a lot
Right.
of the work in the edit was figuring out through cross cutting, like intercutting,
Right.
and just like the amount of time we were allotting to each of the genres and tones, kind of just
Yeah.
figuring out how to balance that. And then I think a lot of it came through sound design and music too, like you said.
Right.
But yeah, like I mean, I can get more into that when we talk more specifically about editing later, but
Hmm.
um, yeah, like the
Yeah.
opening scene was very much like that cross cutting was something that we started doing in the edit because it was like, oh, we kind of need to establish, we had this like thriller world of Mary, the one sister, and then this like domestic drama, like totally different tone of Vivian, the other sister. And
Hmm.
so in the edit, we sort of decided to bring those two into contrast with one another, like right
Right.
from the opening of the film. Yeah.
Um, I'm going to put a note in my head that I hope I don't forget about this note that you just made about contrast, because I do want to come back to that. But you did say something else which sparked an idea in my head about world, this world of Superior. And I think there's certain films where you feel like this world feels different. The rules of this world, the tone, the way people talk, the way people move, it just feels a little bit different. And in a weird way, it just allows you to immerse into it. So talk about building the world of Superior from, the colors and the 16 millimeter grain and the camera angles and everything that you did, and how consciously you approach that theory of world building in script stage and storyboards.
Mm-hmm. Another good question. Yeah, thank you for picking up on that because that is really, so far at least, sort of my jumping off point with projects is thinking about the world and location and sort of like building up from there.
Mhm.
So yeah, again, we had the short film as a jumping off point. We had already sort of established a piece of that world, so that was really helpful. Um, but yeah, a lot goes into. I mean, on the feature, also we decided to specifically set the film in the '80s. The short had been sort of like dated and timeless, but not specifically period.
Mm,
But because I knew we were going to try to do an '80s period piece on like a relatively low budget. A lot of the world building, the prep that went into that was like location scouting. So we ended up shooting in a similar part of upstate New York where we had shot the short film. But I spent a lot of time like driving around, just like knocking on doors, looking for the house, especially the main house, and then a lot of the locations around town. I
mhm.
knew sort of like had to already have that timeless feel, like sort of a dated feel, because we wouldn't be able to just completely build locations or like transform locations.
Right.
So that was a lot of it. And my DP and Mia and I also just like, I have like huge uh, folders, files of like reference images that we're constantly sort of trading and sharing back and forth.
Right.
And those, I think all of that sort of starts to merge once, it's like the images we're looking at help to inform the locations and the colors. And then, our costume designer and production designer also brought a lot
Hmm.
to the table. And yeah, with the '80s period piece, like we were also looking at a lot of music references
Yeah.
for costumes and just like Marion's character, especially like some post punk bands and this documentary that is amazing called The Decline of Western Civilization.
Haven't watched it.
Um, it's great, but it's basically just musical performances from like the late '70s and early '80s.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, what else? Did I start to answer your question?
I
It's a
love it.
long process. Yeah.
I love it. I've mentioned this to a few filmmakers. I don't want to repeat myself necessarily for people who are watching these in a succession, but it's super cool to talk to directors who understand their films, because ultimately you couldn't have made a film like this without understanding it to such a high degree. I think that there's so many conscious decisions that go into making a film that resonates with an audience. I want to talk about one of the undercurrents of this film without going into spoilers, of course, and that is this concept of twins, but also the concept of the other. And one of the things that I was feeling, and I think a few people mentioned that they were feeling as well when they were watching it, is how similar we are to people with whom we seem to have nothing in common with. You talked about these two sisters being opposites, right? In a sense,
Hmm.
is it fair for me to say that they're not really that dissimilar, right? In a
Yeah.
sense, like they're both in a different type of hell,
Yeah,
my perspective,
totally.
right? And
Yeah.
that sort of like merges, but societally speaking, one of those would be absolutely considered the bad kind of hell, and the other one would
Mhm.
be sort of considered a normalized sort of hell. But they're
Mhm.
both in hell, like for
Yeah,
me at least.
totally. They're yeah, that's funny. Yeah, they're both very trapped in their own ways and like unable and like kind of repressed, like unable to communicate what they're struggling with.
Hmm.
Yeah, I definitely think, and that was a lot of what we were thinking about when we were writing, is that sort of the short was about one sister feeling the need to like break away and distinguish herself, and like we added the backstory that she runs away from
Right.
home or like leaves home shortly after that, and in the feature, it's really about them, yeah, coming together, mending the relationship. And like you said, we were interested in this idea that by trading places, which is sort of like this cliche, that we've seen a lot, but that actually that might give them some insight into what they're both going through. And
Hmm.
sort of, I don't know how much that comes out in the film, but sort of spark that understanding between each other again and sort of like recalibrate their relationship to some degree.
Right. I think we live in a world where people have pretty diminished attention spans, and they tend to project a sense of like, oh, I know where this is going. This has been done before. I don't necessarily agree that that the way that you've approached this was necessarily cliche. I don't think. That's just my personal opinion. Of course, I'm biased because we did program it, but you know, so this concept of like twins trading places, one being the good one being the bad one, per se, this has been done before, of course, and you're clearly aware of this. So
Hmm.
how consciously are you approaching this to ensure that you aren't being derivative?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Um, yeah, I mean, it's funny when we were writing, we weren't like, I mean, I think there's a whole lineage, yeah, of films that like informed this to some degree, but like we weren't consciously talking about that so much.
Yeah.
I think we knew, I don't know, I think part of what helped was like working with Alessandra and being so close to Ani too. It's like, they are twins. So even though we're writing something that is very heightened, and they'll be the first to say this is like not really who they are at all, which was I think part of the fun for them.
Yeah.
And also their characters are actually kind of like, if there are shades of themselves in this movie, it's kind of flipped. Like on their, they're actually more like
Each other.
yeah, they're more like their counterpart characters than in real life. But I think, I don't know. I think that helped ground the story for like the feature. Even though we were writing something that's very much like its own world and very
Hmm.
heightened, um, there are shades of their own relationship in it, and I think they
Yeah.
were sort of able to help us ground that and and make me confident that it wasn't going to, that there was something deeper there and that
I think there absolutely is.
or more specific.
Yeah. There's a question here. It's kind of hammering the same thing. Do you get tired of
Uh
the Lynch comps?
yes. Yes.
Yes, you do.
A little bit. Yeah, I mean, I see it for sure, but and I'm obviously a huge fan. I think it's like a
Me too.
good, maybe it's a good, I don't know. I think I need to like work against that more. I didn't feel like we were again like, yeah, I don't know. I have all these influences, but like we weren't consciously talking about Lynch or like trying to make
Yeah.
something that felt like a David Lynch movie.
I
To me, the logic, it's actually to me very different. Like I get the comparisons, but
I think there's a skin and a
it's different
soul,
too.
to every project, right? The skin of Superior feels like it's in the world in a sense of Twin Peaks. I get
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
but the subject, the tone, the characters are not.
Yeah.
Again, in my
Yeah, that
opinion.
makes sense.
So people get a little bit too caught up with the, oh, I've seen this aesthetic before, and therefore they start projecting every single thing. There's a funny thing that I think this goes for anyone who's looking for, and I think this goes for film critics especially. Um, if you're looking for something, you will find it,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Tony
Yes.
Robbins, it was weird to mention Tony Robbins at an during a film Q&A, but he has this practice that he does with his audience where he says, now I want you to scan around and look for everything that's red. Just look for everything that's red, everything that's red, everything that's red. Now close your
Mm.
eyes. Now tell me what was blue.
Mm.
And you don't know what the hell was blue, and there's probably
Yeah.
150 things that were blue, but you were only looking for red. And so if you excessively talk about this whole Twin Peaks Lynch thing, right, then you're going to start looking for parallels. And honestly, if you look for
Mm-hmm.
parallels in if you look for Lynchian influences, I think you find them with how impressively massive his influence has been on film.
Yeah.
You would
It's
find Lynchian
everywhere.
influences in every single film you watch that's
Yeah.
even halfway good, and you would find Malick. You would find so many filmmakers. You would find Spielberg. You'd find so many things. So again, if you consciously look for things, you're going to see them. Um, Okay, so there's another question here from Bojana. I'm curious if the prevalence of the color red was for repressed anger.
Hmm. I like that idea. Yeah. I'm a huge fan of the color red. I'm like so drawn to this color and I love the way it shows up on film. So like I'm always looking for ways to incorporate red. And I think it is a very symbolic color. I feel like I don't really want to pin down what it means totally in the movie. I think it's kind of open to a lot of interpretations, but yeah, it's certainly a through line in the film. It's like Marion is wearing this red jumpsuit from the first frame, and in the end, they both of the sisters end up in red. And I did our costume designer Allie Pierce and I talked a lot about Marion sort of bringing this color home, like bringing it into Vivian's home.
Hmm.
So that this is a small detail, but like I think like 2/3 of the way through the movie, she finds this like sort of maroon reddish jumpsuit at the back
Hmm.
of her sister's closet, and so we liked this idea of Marion sort of like bringing out the red again.
Right.
So I think it
I like that we're
has.
playing tennis here. You're batting me the segues to my next question, which
Okay,
is
great.
which is impressive. And just as I'm complimenting you on that, I've completely forgotten my next question, which is incidentally how this thing sort of works. Okay, patience, audience. Hold on one second. It was a good one. Um, okay, so there's a lot of quiet moments in this film which invite introspection, and you've mentioned already that you don't want to pin down what the red means. So as a filmmaker, I think, if I'm not, please correct me if I'm wrong, that there are certain moments where you would like an audience to feel a certain thing because that's what you were consciously going for.
Yeah.
And I've found that at Pendance in the past with either Ani Simon Kennedy or, a lot of the filmmakers who've attended, they always sit outside their screening and they just sort of scan with their ears to see if the parts that they think were going to do something did it.
Hmm.
Um, t- can you talk about the importance, or your personal feelings about leaving those moments for the audience to interpret what they interpret and bring to the film what they're bringing? Because again, I find that a lot of content these days is very spoon fed because there's a fear of being misunderstood because misunderstanding something is bad. And,
Mm-hmm.
so people walk in and they announce their intentions and they announce their relationship to their characters. And it's extremely annoying because nobody talks like that in real life. But then in Superior, I think the best thing I can say about this film, and if I ever become a film critic, I'll write a I'll write a critique on this film and say this: it's the type of film that 10 different people could enjoy for 10 completely different reasons.
Hmm. Thank
So how
you.
how
That
important?
really means a lot to me. Thank you. Yeah, it is. I like movies that, and I like movies that give you a lot of room yeah, like you're saying, to just have your own thoughts and interpretations as you're experiencing it.
Mhm.
While being, kind of, my goal was to do that, but also, make a film that feels deliberate and that you're sort of being led very deliberately through it.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I mean, even in how we shot, like we often stay, it's a pretty still movie often, and like we often kind of hang back in these like wider shots because I sometimes like just letting the audience experience a scene in a wider, like one take, um, not cutting too much and just sort of, yeah, letting the audience observe and sort of bring whatever to that scene themselves.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's about the balance of those two. Again, I think in the edit, it was like finding a balance between leaving, and I think thinking about editing with our editor Jen Ruff, we did definitely like cut a few things out to give even more room because it was like sometimes on the page, in a script, you need to be a little bit more uh, you need to spell things out a little bit more. And then we found in the edit we could actually take out a couple pieces and
Mhm.
give the film a little bit more breathing room. But I'm glad it feels that way. It's hard for me to. I've seen it so many times. It's sometimes also hard for me to like tell, you know. So that's nice
No,
to hear.
I completely get it. There's a feature that I was working on in post, and there's a scene at the end where a lot of people that are very important to me just happen to be background in that film, in that
Mm.
scene,
Mm-hmm.
and it's supposed to be a really sad scene, but it's sad for me because those people aren't really in my life anymore, and it's sad for me for a completely different reason. And so
Yeah.
when I feel the sadness, I know what I'm looking at, but it's like I have no context on whether anyone else is ever going to feel that sadness. I don't have the connection to those background actors. You know what I mean?
Right.
So it's like
Right.
it's impossible to see the forest from the trees sometimes with your own film.
Yeah.
I do believe time does heal that to some extent. I think if you
Probably.
watch Superior like 5 years from now, you'll be a little bit more distanced from it than the
Probably.
because now, okay, cohesion of vision, right? Writer, director, editor. Well, co-writer, director, co-editor, but
Yeah.
still
Yeah.
involved, very heavily involved in every stage of it. And we are going to talk about it later in the editing panel at 2 o'clock with Chris Mutton. But I do want to, ask how how does that make how does that make it easier? How does it make it harder? Because what you alluded to is the inability to see your own work sometimes.
Yeah,
Um,
and that's why I think it's really important, especially, and we can talk more about that. I do think it's really important in the editing stage to have somebody else at least co-editing, like because you are so close to it, and it's such a long process that,
right.
and it's like you have one way of doing things in your head. It's just, I think more than any other stage, you benefit from a fresh perspective and a different set of eyes.
Well, it's the three films you
Um,
make, right? There's often the saying that there's the film you write, the film you make, the film you edit, right? There
yeah.
are three different films.
Mm-hmm.
And effectively, if things are going correctly, then you improve on the previous version, and every single time you
Mm-hmm.
take the script you edited and make it into a slightly better film, and then take the film you made and make it into a slightly better finished film.
Yeah.
But I have found, especially from talking to directors, that, and I'm curious if this is your experience as well, that sometimes it's the bad ideas that point to the good ideas.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, not bad ideas, but just like
Just the ideas you don't
ideas
agree with.
come
Yeah.
or ideas that like, yeah, I mean the so for example, again, the opening scene, like it was like we were doing some feedback screenings, and like we had such mixed feedback about the opening of the film. And so Jen and I were just like, like we liked it, but like we were understanding some of the feedback, and it was mainly, like I said, that tonally we were
Hmm.
starting off in this like thriller world, and then suddenly we jumped into Vivian's world, just like this small town, and people were very like, it was just very jarring.
Yeah.
So Jen just like randomly was like, what if I drag this like egg in the pan into the opening sequence, like this thriller, sequence? And we just looked at it. And we were like, oh, that's that's kind of good. Like that juxtaposition is actually something neither of us. I don't know. It just kind of it's not random, but like it takes experimentation and like thinking outside the box for sure. And I find that often it takes somebody else to see those things or come up with those kinds of ideas. Um,
Hmm. Can I ask you a question? What is you've done a lot of Q&As for this film, um, like live and virtually. Can you, if you don't mind, share one question that you're done answering?
oh, that's funny.
I just want to make sure that I'm not going to ask it. I'm just
No,
protecting
I don't.
myself. I'm
No,
kidding.
you haven't. I don't think I'm done with. I don't know. I've gotten honestly. I'm pretty impressed by often people's questions and the level of like thought that people have put into the movie and the questions. So, um, I can't think of anything like off the top of my head that has like upset me or that I'm sick of talking about.
It's like something that's been asked in every single interview that you're just like, okay, I answered it 100 times and I'm through with it.
Yeah,
Nothing like that pops up.
not really.
What's it like to be a female filmmaker in Hollywood? Like this,
Oh
does that
no,
get a little,
luckily no one has asked that.
thank God.
I
Um,
mean, yeah, yeah, I think people are moving past that. Yeah, that would definitely be one that I wouldn't even know how to answer that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, no, absolutely. There's so much of this film, Steve. There's a question here. Okay, so this you alluded to here.
Hmm.
What made you want to set the story in the 80s? Because as you
Yeah.
mentioned, the short was somewhat timeless
Yeah.
and the feature was period. So,
Yeah, it's a
you
good
know,
question. It was sort of a lot, like a few different things. Um, the short felt kind of 80s, like 70s, 80s. So we were like, I liked that aesthetic. And um, so that was kind of in the back of our heads.
mm,
I was like a kid in the 80s and was definitely very influenced by the time. And just, I knew I wanted to shoot on film. I wanted the movie to have a lot of texture.
mhm,
Um, I knew I wanted to shoot on film. And a main thing also when we were thinking about story was like definitely did not want there to be cell phones. Like so much of the movie and the story is about communication breakdowns and like
right.
characters not being able to connect. And so it was just like so clear that this movie couldn't take place now or really like any time recently. Um, and then
Yeah,
I think some of what we wanted this to explore with the sisters and like what they were going through, it felt sort of appropriate to that time period. Um, there still very much are stay-at-home moms, and but it was like it just felt like kind of though all those things kind of came together, and it was like let's
mm.
embrace the 80s because that it just felt right. Yeah.
Um, at least when I was growing up, I did know a pair of twins that were in grade school with me, and one of them would often say that when the other one was in pain, that I could feel it somehow, like in my gut, I would know.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about for a second the connection between um, identical twins,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how much research went into that, and perhaps obviously working with two identical
Yeah.
twins probably helped with that, but extensively beyond that, um, like was
Yeah.
there a research phase of talking especially about the bump on the head scene, that
So yeah, that actually comes from them, Ani and Alessandra. That's their story. So that was something that because early on when we were writing the feature, I was like, I want there to be something from your own life and your own relationship in this movie. Like, so
okay.
I was kind of like, and we were, I had been asking them, did people mix you up? Did you ever pretend to be each other? And they didn't really. They were always, I think they were always like in the same classes, and I think they tried it like once and they got caught immediately. And so kind of spooked them, but like they did tell this story about this bump where like one of them had been hurt, and then they over time they couldn't remember, like they both felt like that was their experience, and it felt like a shared pain that they had
Hmm.
had. And I felt like that was a really good sort of like uh just like microcosm story to be planted in the film, that it sort of like relates to everything that's happening in the film. um and in terms of research, I mean, yeah, when I was writing the short, I like read a bunch of interviews with identical twins and definitely went down that road. And then, like I said, two of my best friends growing up were twins, fraternal twins. But I had spent a lot of time with them. And they also, yeah, I think that was a big inspiration. Is they had also talked about feeling this kind of like intuitive connection, knowing when like one of them wasn't okay. And I just have always been really fascinated by that. And yeah,
I
it
was
just,
too, because a need for individuality exists in all of us, right? And
mm-hmm.
most of us, we can at least convince ourselves on our best days that we are pretty unique, right? That we're
Yeah,
not just, there's not another carbon copy of us that can, directly do what we do. But then, being a twin, especially if one twin's really got it figured out, the other one really doesn't. I wonder how much of that is subconsciously driven by a need for individuality in itself, right? Where
yeah,
one goes one way, the other says, okay, you go high, I go low,
mm-hmm.
you go left, I go right.
Yeah,
Just as that push for, again, in a sort of like human need for uh, being your own person and sort of separating from that womb connection, if that
yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think all those feelings are, yeah, what you're describing, I think is totally apt for most twins. And like, um, it just feels like there's sort of some extremes of feelings of dependency and wanting to be independent, but like, but also like a real, like with Ani and Alessandra, they are so close, and like they value that a lot too.
Hmm.
And it, you know, because it is so singular. So
Right.
it is really interesting. There's kind of like a push pull, I think, always going on. And
Right.
um, yeah.
No, it's interesting. There's a is there something about this film that you think people often misunderstand?
Hmm. Um, I'm not sure. There are people misunderstanding something about it. Not in my conversations, I don't think. Some people miss the 80s, that it's specifically 80s, which is interesting, but
I've
it
noticed that.
doesn't, it doesn't like need, you know, I don't think you need to know that, but
Right.
um, I actually thought it was too, like, there's the calendar that you see like quite a few times in the kitchen that's 1987, and I was like, are we being too, like, planting this too obviously? But so it's interesting to me that some people miss that. I
Well,
totally get it. It's a detail in the background, but I don't think it makes or breaks the movie. You don't need to know what year it is. Um,
yeah, no, I think there's always that fine line between, when you lose an audience for even a question, right? Because again, like I've always felt that feature films, short films, they're like a sailboat and you
mhm.
can't rip at the sail, right? You have to
Mhm.
guide the audience towards one emotion and another emotion. You take them on an emotional journey, which eventually leads to catharsis. And
Mhm.
so if sometimes this unfortunately happens where an audience member says, well, why would someone say that
Right.
in their
Yeah.
head, whether they say it out loud, if they're, the loud asshole at the movie who's just like, come on, man, who says that, or whether they just say it quietly to themselves. And in the moment of asking that question of why wouldn't someone just pick up a cell phone and call
Right.
someone in this situation, I would do that, they would then lose the next 30 seconds of focus. And
It's
then they
true.
would need another 30 seconds to just come back into focus. We have such a strong focus on this at Pendance, where we'll often like program shorts in a block. And if a short ends on a like extremely like introspective note,
Mhm.
then we can't program a short after it that starts on an an equally
Yeah.
introspective
Oh,
note,
totally. Yeah.
or one
Like
that's very
lose the
plot
audience for
driven.
that time. Yeah.
Absolutely, and then everyone's lost. So I
Yeah.
think again, there were definitely a few. I read a few comments about Superior where it was like, yeah, like why not? And it's like, oh, you missed the '80s part. Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. I mean, I would think even if you didn't see that it's specifically 1987, it's pretty obviously period.
it is, right?
Like
Everything, the
the
car, the costumes,
cars, the
everything,
costumes, the appliances in their kitchen,
the
like
hairstyles.
the
Gosh,
hairstyles. Yeah, that's
yeah.
interesting.
It's just like,
Yeah,
how
I
much
guess
more
that's a big
obvious do I
one.
have to make things in
I guess
2022?
that's a big
In
one.
2022, yeah, pretty obvious apparently.
I think
Um,
someone did once ask me another thing I just thought of is like, why doesn't, why doesn't Marion just tell Vivian what's going on? And it's like, that is a valid question. For
yeah,
me, it's funny. I am from originally from Minnesota, which is like a very repressed culture, I feel like. To me, it's like very normal that people, and in a lot of my research also about, I did do quite a bit of research about like domestic violence and just like,
mm,
women sort of trying to get away from an abusive partner. And like, it's very common for people to bury that and not be able to talk about it, even with their closest family and friends. So, to me, it is an interesting question. Someone did ask me that, and but that's kind of what the movie is about to me. Is that both, like I said, both of the sisters are like not really able to talk about what they're going through, um, and the
yeah,
movie is sort of playing out that like what happens when you can't talk. Like it's sort of like,
yeah. I'm not gonna like harp on like trash movies and trash TV, but there is a sense of like over the last 15 to 20 years, increasingly we have seen, more and more films where everything is announced
hmm,
to the other characters as
mm-hmm,
a voice box or a exposition piece for the audience, so that
mm,
and I think that that's an interesting thing about, and I guess like I have one last question for you. There's one last audience question for you too, is
nice,
how do you so test screenings, you mentioned you had test screenings with the editor
mm-hmm,
and there were certain things that the audience maybe were mixed on but you were committed to.
mm-hmm,
So talk about the importance of sticking with your gut even when the audience
yeah,
in the test screening, because they are just a certain number of people from a certain
yeah,
place, right? You're not asking one individual from every country in the world for their opinion. It's like there's a definitely a slant in that group. There are
yeah.
people who agreed to be test audiences. Number one, there's a
Yeah,
bias, sample bias there. So talk
that's
about,
hard. I think it's really hard. I think it's one of the biggest challenges of filmmaking is like, because it is such a long process, there's so many moving pieces. Like keeping track of the thing,
hmm,
keep like having a compass is it can be like very hard. But yeah, I do think it's a matter of like continuously sort of like checking in with the thing that you set out to do and really trying to keep track of the movie you had in your head when you started. And certain people, yeah, but at the same time, it's like you're not going to make a film in a vacuum. That's also not, I think it's like really important to get feedback. And I think and to listen to that, and it often results in like some of the best changes, in
yeah,
editing especially. But I think also it's about figuring out who are your people, like who to send cuts
yes,
to and who to listen to and
yeah,
which feedback is sort of like I think of it as like resonating, like it just which
yeah,
kind of like rings true with the movie that you're trying to make and which is clearly just like
hmm.
this person doesn't like this genre or like maybe just isn't gonna like this movie. This movie is just not for them, and that's
No,
okay.
absolutely. It's like there's cinematic references and style and perspective, and there's obviously an audience that you're making a film for. I'm always reminded of 2019, we screened a film by a Greek filmmaker, Aria, which incredible film. If someone out there hasn't gone to see it, check it out. It's online. Um, incredible film, and in it the filmmaker just used 85 millimeter, a lot of handheld shots,
Mm-hmm.
and someone walked out of the screening and said, I could have made that,
Oh,
you know. And that's like,
oh
I'm like,
no.
I'm I'm reminded that perhaps even in Picasso's time there were people who walked in and said I could do that, right? But you're right, and I think this brings me to something that John Truby once said to me, which was, that 99% of people cannot or will not give you critical feedback,
Mm.
right? They can't on your script, on your film. They're just not capable of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's honest, yes, and it should be considered, yes, to understand it. Um, but there has to be like a limit to that. Like,
Mm.
I think like there's certain things they can tell you, like, was that easy to understand, was that not easy to understand, was that funny, was that not funny. I think that that's important, but in terms
Yeah.
of like character plot development and
Right, right, right.
cinematography and stuff,
Yeah.
there just aren't a lot, so if you have a particular style, like, so for instance, not to draw on the Twin Peaks thing, but Twin Peaks was very revolutionary, when it came out,
Mm-hmm.
for just using odd camera angles. And I'm sure someone who's used to watching television back then would be like, why is their camera
Oh,
slanted?
totally.
That's not
Yeah.
normal, you know?
I feel like I've read a lot of cases of films that when they came out were panned that now it's like have become classics, called classics, or just are
2001: A
classics.
Space Odyssey.
Yeah, a lot of Kubrick, like The Shining too, which is honestly was a huge influence on the short, and like
Yeah.
I'm just a huge fan of
Oh, I
Kubrick.
feel it. The
Yeah,
twins, the everything. Yes, no,
totally.
absolutely. And I think,
But
yeah,
yeah, I remember people saying like, "Oh, the performances are so over the top," and it's like, yes, that's what's great about it.
no, it's consistent, and
Yeah.
it's a really interesting film. And I feel perhaps the best thing about this film is it really has a voice. Like, you can feel it. It's like throughout, it's an undercurrent of a director who's really saying something.
Mm.
So I think
Thank
that's
you.
really interesting. No, my pleasure. Don't think we have any more questions here. What was the process? Hmm. Okay, I mean, this is a bit of a softball, and I feel like we've already touched on this. But what was the process
Oh
of going,
yeah.
like going from short to feature? Were there any hurdles you had to overcome? I guess any specific hurdles other than what you talked
Um,
about? Because I guess you alluded to the fact that making the feature was much harder. So perhaps that question stems from that thought.
yeah, I mean that I think is just the hurdles of um, making any feature. It's just a
Yeah,
big endeavor, and like not having done it, it was
yeah.
there was a huge learning curve just
Yeah.
in
Well, if
planning
anyone out
and
there is like making a a low budget feature, definitely consider shooting on film, which is super not, cheap. Consider having
yeah,
snow involved,
yeah,
definitely. Consider having so many different locations and so many different actors. Honestly,
yeah.
it's so ambitious as hell, this project, and kudos for pulling it off so well.
Thank
It's
you,
incredible.
thank you.
Um, thank you for joining us. We'll see you again in an hour and 10 minutes. Grab a
Yes,
coffee. We're going to
sounds
do that
good.
editing panel. I'm looking forward to it a lot.
Likewise.
Um, thanks for joining us,
Thanks
and
for having me.
thanks for being part of Pen Dance.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.